Welcome to 20-minute tips and topics. Today we're meeting with Chris Sanderson of Sanderson Test Prep to talk about COVID cancellations and how to just conceptualize your testing plan, um, given where we are at with testing and COVID in January 2021. Today with us, I've got Dana Ponsky, who I'll let introduce herself.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Dana Ponsky, your guide to college. And with Nicole, we go ahead and present 20-minute tips and topics. So we're really excited today to have Chris talk to us about test prep. I am based in Brooklyn, New York. I've been a college counselor now for over 10 years. Love working with high school students, college students, graduate students, whatever type of student and family to help make sure to take the college process, make it very successful, but also do it with a lot less stress.
And then we got Chris Sanderson from Sanderson Test Prep with us. Go ahead, Chris.
Hi, I'm Christopher Sanderson. My company is called Sanderson Test Prep. We provide tutoring services and small group classes to students looking to prepare in any academic subject area, along with standardized tests like SATs, ACTs, and all of those kinds of admissions tests that students love doing so much.
And then
These
here's
are the
a
subject
list.
areas that I teach.
So
Okay,
first
so
we
how
want
to find a test center. I think that something that has been extremely frustrating for a lot of students of mine in the last several months is registering for tests and having a test site cancel, sometimes even the day of or the week of, where it's too late for a student to register for another location or to even to register to do standby testing somewhere. And so I want to talk about a couple of tips where students can hopefully register for a test site where they're going to have a good chance of actually being able to take their test, because it is heartbreaking. I had a student, for example, for the December SAT who registered for the test, did not receive any type of email correspondence, and the day of the test drove an hour and a half, because this is a student in California who was in an area in the Bay Area where everything was shut down. So intentionally, when registering for the test a month and a half before, selected a test center that was far away where they thought they would have a better chance to test. And the day of, drove an hour and a half and arrived at 7:30 in the morning after leaving the house at 6, and got there and the building is closed and the test is not taking place. And that kind of frustration for a student who is planning on taking a December test and now has to wait until March it's heartbreaking for me as an instructor to see a student who has put so much work into preparing, see them have to deal with the idea of staying fully engaged and continuing their practice for that stretch of time when they thought that they were going to be able to potentially be one and done like that day. It's hard to see. So a couple tips. One is review previous test site cancellations. And luckily College Board and ACT are very forthcoming about publishing the kinds of site closures that they've seen. And that's a really good way of picking a good test location, because if you see that a particular test location has canceled 3 out of 3 tests throughout the fall, they canceled an October, November, and December SAT, or they canceled a September, October, and December ACT, then that's a good indication that that center, based on their location, based on the surrounding population, based on the COVID numbers, that's a good indication that that center is not as likely to open up for a new test date. And that's something that students should look at when selecting a test site, so that they can pick a site that has a decreased likelihood of canceling on them on short notice. And the other thing is staying tuned to news. And I know news isn't the most exciting, thing for students to pay attention to, but it is really important to look at not only the COVID numbers, but also the impact of those COVID numbers in your desired test location. Look at what kinds of schools are being closed. Look at outside measures outside of the education spectrum. do you have restaurants closed, businesses closed? What kinds of closures are there in the area that you're planning on testing? Because sometimes that's an indication of whether or not a test center is likely to remain open. Do you have curfews in place in a particular area? If you look at all of those things, those can oftentimes be really helpful indicators of whether or not there's a good likelihood that the test center that you're registering for is going to remain open for your desired test date. And then once the vaccine rolls itself out, we're going to have to take a look ahead and see how this might change things. More centers are going to be open, and some of those centers are likely going to require some sort of documentation. And it says here on the slide, don't be that kid. And let's talk about who that kid is. So when it says don't be that kid, I know I am going to get this call this coming summer or maybe fall. And I don't want you listening to this to be the one who falls into this, where you've gotten the vaccine. You have taken all the measures necessary to make yourself ready to test. You have jumped through the necessary hoops to where you are able to show up at any test center and perform your best on this test that you have prepared for. And all of a sudden, the night before, they say, hey, tomorrow, we need you to bring with you your ID and also some proof of your vaccination. And then it's a student or a parent scrambling around the house, looking through drawers, saying, oh, wait, yeah, we got the vaccine, but where did we put the actual documentation? Where did we put that piece of paper with the signature on it? Where did we file that? Is it something that got crumpled up in a pocket and accidentally thrown away? How do we figure this out? Are we going to have to call our doctor the night before and try to figure out an alternate means of proving, this vaccination? Show up at our physician's house and ask her or him to, hey, is there any chance you could reproduce this documentation? You know that we got the vaccine with you 3 months ago, 4 months ago, 5 months ago. So just to keep matters organized and straightforward, keep track of that documentation as you get it, because it is very likely within the next year that that documentation is going to be required when those test dates arrive. And we don't want it to come as a surprise to students the night before a test. Not only is it important to make sure that a student has the ability to test, but it's also important to test day performance to make sure that you're not dealing with that kind of stress the night before your exam where you're in scramble mode. We want to make sure that students the night before say, I've got everything in place. I can go to sleep early, get a good night's rest, wake up and be as sharp as possible so I can perform my best on test day. When it comes to ACT, ACT is unrolling an online test. They have already issued, within the last month, they issued instructions for schools and test centers to how they can unroll the online test. And they are very close to making this available to the masses. So we certainly anticipate this unrolling on a national level within the year, but it's not there quite yet. So for right now, hang on, anticipate the typical test day experience and the in-person on-paper testing, but know that coming soon, ACT is actually very close to unrolling an online test, and they are very good actually about keeping their website updated. So go to act.org and they have very regular updates about the likelihood of being able to offer online testing. And when it comes to AP exams, another type of test that students are preparing for, last year, any students who took an AP exam last year thought to themselves, wow, this is great. It's a shortened exam. It's 45 minutes. It's open book. I can take it at home. This is going to provide the ease. And we saw a slight increase in scores because of that, but it wasn't a shocking amount. There was under 10% increase in the number of 4s and 5s on last year's AP exams, but nonetheless, it was still a significant increase. based on the slight watering down of scores because of the testing format. This year, they are going back to regular testing. So they have full length in person tests available at schools that are providing in person experiences. They are possibly looking at an online test offered to try to make it accessible to the most students. That online test is not something that will require a 3+ hour internet connection. You require an internet connection initially when the test is released so that you can download it onto your system. You're given a window of time to answer the questions on the test. And then they're offering a short window of time at the end of that test into which you can upload that. So you don't have to have a consistent internet streaming availability in order to take the test. You can have access to internet for a short window of time, take the exam, and then have access to internet for a short window of time in order to upload your answers to that exam. So that's intended to maximize the accessibility of the test. And they are still trying to provide everyone the opportunity to test, but it is going to lean towards the full length style exam. So for students, especially students who have AP experience from last year, who are looking to the opportunity of having that shortened test where you can do it at home with open note, you're not going to have that same test experience this year. They're getting back into the regularity of AP testing and the rigor of a lengthier exam that's going to test a little bit more of your knowledge in that particular subject area.
If I can add, I was going to say that there are schools that are offering the test right now that are in person for the SAT and ACT, but because they are private schools, they're actually requiring students to get tested before they come to the testing site, and they have to show proof of that. So if you are finding yourself able to find a center that is open, but there's a likelihood they may require that you have testing done, you need to make sure that you schedule that within a 3 to 5 day window prior to your actual test. And I think that there are students who are showing up not knowing that. So it's important not to just, if you have a test center that's open, that's great, but make sure you know the rules of that test center, which can be more than what the College Board or the ACT is requiring.
And I think that's a great point. I think that also speaks to the idea of just being overly careful about keeping track of any type of documentation that you have, whether it's a negative COVID test or vaccination. In this upcoming year, that documentation is going to become increasingly relevant.
I completely agree. And I also want to circle back a little bit, just talking about kind of larger, and I'll keep it short, the larger perspective of college admissions on testing. There is a lot of forgiveness right now from schools that previously had required test scores for students who haven't been able to test. And I don't know what the two of you feel, but I feel like that flexibility and forgiveness is going to continue for a while. I don't know that they're going to be able to change that at the drop of a hat once vaccines really start rolling out and getting traction, because it's not being, vaccinations aren't happening equitably across the country, and we're only at level 1B, which doesn't include a lot of, the younger populations. So I want to reiterate to students, if you can't get a test, specifically SAT, ACT, or subject tests, don't panic. There is flexibility within that. But of course, I do feel that if you do have a test score, or if you're able to get an exam under your belt, that's really beneficial to you. So, try and listen to what Chris is saying, use these strategies to help locate a testing place. But do also know that your colleges are being very understandable about this right now.
Absolutely. And I think that from my understanding, and Nicole and Dana can speak more informed to this point, but from my understanding, I think that what schools are looking for is, that you gave it the old college try, so to speak, that you give it an honest attempt to test. And there's a difference between a student who registered for 2 or 3 or 4 SATs or ACTs, and they had their test site canceled the day of or within a few days of, and there was nothing they could do. They live in an area of the country where there's nothing that is in realistic distance where they could go and take a test on test day, and they didn't have a real opportunity. I think there's a greater degree of forgiveness for that than somebody who said, oh, I can use this as a little bit of a crutch to avoid testing, and I'm just not going to test because I don't feel like it, and I'm going to use COVID as an excuse. And I think that colleges are actively making sure that they are generous enough with students who gave every effort to test and it just didn't work out. And I think that, to me, from my understanding, that that's a different story to tell admissions than I had several opportunities to test right down the street from my house within locations that were not canceled. And I just chose not to because I was hoping that everywhere would go test optional or test blind. And so I decided that I'm not going to put forth that effort to even try to prepare for or take this test.
Yeah, well said. So now we'll transition to prepping online.
Oh, prepping online. So it's certainly a different beast than what students have experienced normally. And there are some advantages that you can take away when prepping online. But there are very easy bad habits to fall into. And that's one thing that we want to make sure that people stay vigilant about. So, one is the first bullet point that we see here is please print your practice test. It's a very small thing and it might not seem like a big deal, but I promise in a test day experience, it's actually transformative. If you've gotten used to staring at a test on screen, and then on test day, that's the first time you're interacting with a full length exam on paper, then that is going to be a challenge for you to make that conversion. So get used to printing out your practice tests. If you are going to take a practice test, they're available online. And if you take the time to print it out and take it like a paper test, then you're going to be that much better prepared for taking a paper test when it comes test day. Another one is time management. I think that when prepping online, a lot of times students get very used to conveying their answer choices in different ways. And it might sound silly, but literally circling your answer choice and then having to convey that onto a Scantron and bubble in the appropriate spot, those are things that affect time. Maybe it's an extra second per question. Maybe it's an extra 2 seconds per question. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but when you're talking about a 60 question section of a test, that's a couple of minutes of additional time that it takes to get used to putting it onto paper, making sure you're lining up like the correct answer choices, knowing how you're going to manage that. I recommend students select all their answer choices to a given page, circle them each. If it's questions 13 through 18, then circle the answer choices to 13 through 18 on that particular, let's say it's a writing and language use passage. Circle those answer choices and then bubble them all in collectively, but making sure that you figure out the appropriate time management, not only from timing yourself from a practice standpoint, which anyone should do, but timing it out and getting used to the actual in-person and on-paper testing format is important to do, because a lot of students get too used to being able to either click on or type in their answer choices when on test day they might not have that luxury. And then lastly, the big thing, and this is so gigantic, and this really goes out to both students and parents, but the distractions at home, your at-home study space. Do you have siblings around, parents around, family members? Is there noise in the background? Do you have pets that are in and out of the room or making background noise? Do you have deliveries at the door where, you know, the doorbell is ringing, the pets are going nuts, somebody's yelling down, hey, can you get the door? You know, all of those things. And then the classic example is your own room. It sounds insulting to say, and I'm so sorry, but guess what? Your room is distracting. It is. And I think that it's really effective for students to get used to the idea of finding a real prep space within their own home that is outside of their room, outside of their comfort zone, because that's better prep for the way that you're going to experience your interaction with the test on test day. If you're not used to taking a practice test in your parents' room, in the dining room, in the office, whatever area of the house it is, something outside of your own room and your own comfort zone is really important to give yourself the exposure to and experience of, so that come test day, those slight changes in environment, in lighting, in background noise, etc., are not something that throw you for as much of a loop, because you've given yourself a chance to practice testing in a slightly unfamiliar environment. And that's really important to test day success. So those couple of things are really important to being able to control the distractions for the at-home study space and the at-home practice testing space.
And I've got a question, Chris. You might get into this in the next slide, but most testing spaces, I'm assuming all testing spaces actually, are going to require the student to have a face covering while they're sitting for the exam. Would practicing with a face covering on be helpful, because that is a distraction in itself, or at least getting one that's comfortable, knowing that you're going to be okay with wearing it for multiple hours on end?
Absolutely. And I think that's a great question, because depending on what your situation is, but if you're in school in person, even if it's a couple days a week, you might be used to wearing a face covering for 6, maybe even 8 hours a day. If you're not doing that, if you're not doing a hybrid or in-person model, but you're doing school fully remotely, you don't get used to wearing a face covering for that length of time. You might be used to wearing a face covering, but a lot of times it's a face covering that you put on for those 5 or 10 minutes when you go into the grocery store to grab 2 items. You might be putting that face covering on for 5 or 10 minutes when you go over to a friend's house to pick up something, like they had, maybe a copy of a practice test that you wanted to look at. And you said, hey, I'd love a copy of that. Let me swing by and pick that up. Whatever the scenario is, a lot of times people get used to wearing face coverings for relatively short periods of time. And Nicole, that's a great question, because a lot of times when it comes to test day, it's the first time a student has ever been required to wear a face covering for that length of time if they're not currently in school in person. So I do think it is important to A, practice with that, and B, find the right type of face covering to make sure that it's something that is comfortable enough to you for that span of time. There's a lot of things that might feel comfortable for 10 minutes that would not feel comfortable for 6 hours or 5 hours. And so I think when you're looking at extended periods of time, it's really important to make sure you provide yourself the preparedness, but also the comfort level so that you can perform your best. So a couple of these things are going to be standard recommendations about prep. One is, how much time should you spend preparing? And with SAT and ACT, when you first start preparing, you're going to see an initial spike. Your score is going to go up in the early goings a little bit more significantly. You're going to have a steep spike in the slope, if you will, steep slope, but then it's going to level off a little bit, and pretty good standard allotment of what you can anticipate in terms of point increase. For SAT, you're going to have your initial jump, and then the incremental increase is going to be about 10 points per week. And for ACT, you'll have that initial spike, and then you're going to see about a 1 point every 3-week increase. So a good testing plan is to walk yourself back from a target test date and anticipate that 10 points per week SAT increase, or that 1 point every 3-week ACT increase as your baseline, and then allow yourself that cushion of the initial spike to put you over the hump of wherever you want your target score to be. So when you're coming up with your testing plan, if you say to yourself, I would like to take the March SAT, okay, well then that's going to be 12 weeks away. So, what do I do for that? Or that's going to be 8 weeks away. What do I do for that? So anticipate that 10 point per week increase and say, okay, if the March test is 8 weeks away, that would be an 80-point increase that I could anticipate comfortably. And then I might have an initial spike that allows me to eclipse that mark a little bit. But it's also important to keep in mind that these are all going to be in flux depending on your availability and your time to dedicate to prep specifically.
Is there an anything else related to like COVID specific, like just thinking about, does a student want, and sorry, I know that we're trying to stick to 20 minutes, but just with the fluctuation in testing, whether or not it's open or not open, do you advise students to start prepping a little earlier, or are you really like feeling comfortable with that week by week testing plan that you just laid out?
That's a pretty good plan. We'll see how things start to open up. I do think that right now might be a unique opportunity for a lot of students to spend additional time prepping that when full activities, sports, extracurriculars, community service, etc., like start to open up. I do think that it is easy to forget how much time that takes out of one's schedule. So I do think that if given the opportunity to spend a little bit more time on prep now, and for example, this coming summer, I don't know what activities students have planned, but if you had planned to go participate in a college program where you're staying on campus and taking classes and living in the dorms, with some of your peers while getting exposure to that particular campus. If that program is canceled, well, then maybe this summer is going to provide you an added opportunity to prep. Or if you are currently in a time of year where you would normally be in the thick of it in your season of a particular sport, but that sport has been canceled because of COVID reasons, then think about those 2 or 3 hours a day of practice that you would normally be spending that now open up opportunities for you to add other things into your schedule. And if that means maximizing on your performance when it comes to test prep because you have that added time, then it is opportunistic for you to recognize that. And instead of using that time to take a couple hours a day to play Fortnite or whatever it might be that occupies your time, you might have a chance to better prepare yourself for something that's going to last a lot longer for you and give you an opportunity to check off a box earlier in the process than you otherwise might have. The takeaway. So testing landscape continues to change and evolve. My best recommendation is the sites that we give you at the beginning. Check College Board and ACT's sites for upcoming closures and make sure that you're well informed about that so that you can select test locations that are going to give you the greatest opportunity to test. And familiarize yourself with testing policies. Do you have to wear a mask the whole time? Do you have to wear gloves? Do they require you, to social distance within a particular classroom? Get used to what you are going to feel as the testing environment as best as possible. If that means taking practice tests with a mask on, then it's something that can be hugely valuable to performing your best on test day. Do your best to get a test date, and that means doing your research. So don't be lazy about just, oh, this site's available, let me just go ahead and register for that one, but do your research to make sure that that's the site that's going to allow you the best opportunity to test and maximize this opportunity to prep. If you have 2 hours a day free because you don't have your typical like sports practice, then that's a great opportunity to take advantage of that same time in order to be able to maximize your ability to perform your best on test day. And be smart about your testing timeline. So make sure that you look ahead to what your activity schedule is like and what your prep schedule is like so that you can really maximize your performance on a particular test by giving yourself the best opportunity to test at a time of year where you have the most opportunity to really commit yourself to performing the best on these kinds of standardized tests. And if you have further questions, happy to chat. Please feel free to reach out at the email or website that you see here. And the phone number, you can always call or text 305-878-TEST, which is 305-878-8378.
Thank you so much for your time with us today, Chris. Just a lot of wisdom that you shared with us. And I think that it's really good to get families thinking, our rising juniors or even people who are testing earlier about all these different components of test prep and testing planning for testing. that are complicated by the situation that we're finding ourselves in right now with the pandemic. So thank you so
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
of course. And then here's our contact information for me, Nicole Walberg at Walberg College Counseling. You can reach me in San Antonio at 210-596-9567 or at the email address there. And then we've got the lovely Dana Ponsky at Dana Ponsky Consulting Services.
I was gonna say the screen, if can you, is it?
Oh,
it doesn't
yes,
show.
I didn't transition. Thank you for the reminder.
There you go. So like Nicole said, she's at walbergcc.com, her phone number, as well as her email. And I'm at consultwithdana.com. Phone number, email is there as well. We're really happy that everyone could join us today. We hope the information you found is valuable. The three of us are available at any time to answer any types of questions that you might have. And we're just hopefully with the new year, that hopefully will actually be a new year. It doesn't seem like it's changed much, but with the new year, hopefully we'll be able to continually support you through the process with college counseling and anything else you need to kind of navigate high school. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. See you